The conference room was a study in cold elegance, with dark wood paneling and a crystal chandelier casting soft light across the polished mahogany table. I, Madison Heiress, sat at the far end, trying to make myself invisible among Theodore Spears' distant relatives. These were faces I'd never seen before, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. They weren't here to mourn the man they'd barely known. They were here to claim a piece of his vast fortune. I was just the nurse who'd cared for Theodore in his final months. Invited to this while reading out of courtesy, or so I thought. I was already gathering my things to leave when the lawyer, Charles Hill, finished reading the smaller bequests, modest sums for staff and charities. But then his voice cut through the room, sharp and deliberate. Miss Heiress, what is your full legal name? I looked up, startled, my hand still clutching my purse. Madison Heiress, I said, my voice wavering slightly, unsure why he was singling me out. Mr. Hill's eyes locked onto mine, piercing, as if he could see straight through me. Your full legal name, Miss Heiress. I swallowed hard and repeated, more slowly, Madison Elizabeth Heiress. The room fell so silent I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. But I've always gone by Madison, I added, a knot of unease tightening in my chest. Mr. Hill smiled, a small, enigmatic smile, and said, Miss Heiress, I'm referring to you. Theodore Spears has left his entire estate, valued at approximately $12 million, to his beloved niece, Elizabeth Heiress. The room exploded into chaos. Theodore's relatives shouted, demanded explanations, and threatened lawsuits, but I barely registered their voices. My world was spinning, as if the ground had been yanked out from under me. Elizabeth Heiress? Was that me? I wasn't his niece. I was just his nurse. The one who'd eased his pain in his final days. How could this be happening? Let's rewind to the moment I first met Theodore Spears. The man who would turn my life upside down. It was a gray, drizzly morning when I got the call from Janet, my supervisor at the private nursing agency where I moonlighted. Madison, we've got a tough one, she said, her voice tight with urgency. Theodore Spears, 78. Loaded, but difficult. He's gone through 6 nurses in the last 4 months. They're offering double the usual rate. But I've got to warn you, he's a handful. I hesitated. My full-time hospital job already consumed my life, leaving little room for anything else. But double pay was hard to ignore, especially with my nursing school loans still hanging over me. I want to meet him first, I said, to see if we're a good fit. The next day, I stood before the Spears mansion, a towering structure of old money grandeur, with marble columns and manicured gardens that stretched out like a painting. Mrs. Clark, the stern housekeeper, led me through corridors lined with oil paintings, each one likely worth more than my yearly salary. He's in his study, she said, her tone carrying a warning. He's having a rough day. I stepped into the study, a cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive window overlooking the estate's gardens. Theodore Spears sat in a leather-upholstered wheelchair, his frail frame diminished by illness, but his eyes sharp as a hawk's. When he saw me, his lips curled into a dismissive smirk. Another nurse, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. How long do you think you'll last? The record's 3 weeks. I pulled up a chair, sitting at his eye level, unfazed. Depends on how long you need me, I replied, my tone calm but firm. His eyebrows shot up, clearly not used to someone meeting his sharpness head-on. The doctors give me 6 months, he said, his voice dropping to a grim note. Pancreatic cancer. Nothing they can do but manage the pain and wait for the end. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. I'm so sorry, I said, and I meant it. That must be terrifying. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. Terrifying? Young lady, I've lived 78 years, built a business empire, and amassed more wealth than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying alone. Forgotten, with nothing to show for my life but a bank account. His words hit me hard, not just for their honesty but for the deep loneliness they revealed. I asked, what about your family? His face darkened, his voice turning bitter. Family? I've got a pack of distant relatives who only call when they want a handout. They're circling like vultures now, waiting for me to kick the bucket so they can fight over my estate. I looked at him, sensing the isolation that surrounded this man. Despite his unimaginable wealth, that sounds lonely, I said softly. He met my gaze, his sharp eyes softening just a fraction. It is, he admitted. So, Miss Heiress, Madison Heiress, are you here to rob me? Flatter me, or actually help me? I gave him a small smile. I'm here to take care of you. Whatever that means. Over the next few weeks, I learned that Theodore's difficult reputation was mostly a shield. He'd been burned by too many people, employees who stole, relatives who begged for money, friends who vanished when his health failed. But beneath the gruff exterior was a man who was brilliant, well-read, and surprisingly witty when he let his guard down. He shared stories of his childhood in the Great Depression, how he clawed his way to wealth through grit and savvy investments, and his regret for never starting a family. I always thought there'd be time, he said one afternoon as I helped him with his physical therapy exercises. But time never came. I asked, do you regret it? He stared out the window, his voice quiet. Every damn day. Money buys a lot, Miss Heiress, but it doesn't buy people who genuinely care about you. Our relationship evolved from professional to something closer to friendship. Each morning, I'd find him waiting in the study, a book he wanted to discuss or a story he was eager to tell. He was curious about my life, my hospital job, my tiny apartment, the simple joys I found in everyday things. You seem happy, he remarked one day, even though you don't have much. I smiled. I have enough. I have work that matters and people who care about me. That's more than a lot of rich folks can say. He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Indeed. Theodore started asking about my family, my upbringing, my dreams. I told him about my single mom, who raised me alone, about putting myself through nursing school, about my hope to one day open a free clinic for underserved communities. He was particularly interested when I mentioned my mom, asking about her maiden name, where she grew up, when she moved to our city. I thought he was just curious, trying to understand a life so different from his own. But now, sitting in this conference room, hearing Mr. Hill call me Elizabeth Heiress, I started to wonder if there was more to his questions than I'd realized. The conference room felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with the relatives' outrage. Their voices overlapped in a cacophony of accusations and threats, each one vying for a piece of Theodore Spears' fortune. I stood frozen by the door, my purse clutched tightly, ready to slip out and escape the chaos. My mind was still reeling from Mr. Hill's words, Elizabeth Heiress, Theodore's niece. It didn't make sense. I was Madison, the nurse who'd spent months changing IV drips and coaxing a stubborn old man to take his meds. Not some long-lost heiress. But before I could make my exit, Mr. Hill's voice rose above the din, steady and commanding. Miss Heiress, I was referring to you. I turned back, my heart pounding. There's been a mistake, I stammered. I wasn't mentioned in the staff bequests. I'm not Elizabeth. I'm Madison. Mr. Hill raised a hand for silence, his expression calm but unyielding. Miss Heiress, may I ask your full legal name again? I swallowed hard, the room's eyes boring into me. Madison Elizabeth Heiress, I said, my voice barely audible, but I've always gone by Madison. And your mother's maiden name? Mr. Hill pressed. Elizabeth Jones, I replied, still not grasping where this was going. And your grandmother's name? I hesitated, a memory flickering to life. Willow, I said, then stopped dead as the name hit me like a freight train. Willow Spears. The room fell silent again. But this time it was different, a stunned, electric silence, as if a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. Mr. Hill's smile widened, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Miss Heiress, you are indeed Theodore Spears' niece. Your grandmother, Willow Spears, was his younger sister. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. That's impossible, I whispered. My mom never said anything about a family like this. She told me her family was gone. Mr. Hill's voice softened. Your grandmother and Theodore had a falling out when she was young. She thought he was too obsessed with money. Too cold. She left, cut ties, and built a new life. Theodore spent decades trying to find her, and you. My head spun. How could my mother, who'd raised me in a cramped apartment with barely enough to get by, have been part of this world of wealth and privilege? And how had Theodore known I was his niece? He saw your photo through the nursing agency, Mr. Hill explained, as if reading my thoughts. You're the spitting image of your grandmother, Willow, in her youth. He had a hunch, but he needed proof. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an old photograph, sliding it across the table. I picked it up with trembling hands. The woman in the black and white image had my eyes, my cheekbones, my dark hair. It was like looking into a mirror. Except she wore a bell-bottomed dress from the 1970s. The resemblance is uncanny, Mr. Hill said. But Theodore didn't stop there. He had a DNA test done on a water glass you used during your first week. The results confirmed it. You're his biological niece. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. A DNA test? Without my knowledge? It felt invasive, almost like a betrayal. But then I remembered Theodore's sharp eyes. The way he'd studied me during our conversations. Asking about my mom, my childhood, my life. It wasn't just curiosity. He'd been searching for answers. Piecing together a family he'd lost long ago. But why didn't he tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. Why keep it a secret? Mr. Hill's expression turned solemn. Theodore wanted to be sure, not just of your identity, but of your character. He'd found another woman, Elizabeth Carver, who claimed to be his niece. She'd been hounding him for money for years, showing up with demands and flattery. He needed to know who you really were. The name Elizabeth Carver sparked a vague memory. There'd been days when Theodore seemed unusually tired or agitated, mentioning difficult visitors he didn't want to see. I'd assumed it was business associates or nosy relatives. But now it made sense. He'd been testing us both, weighing our motives, our hearts. You showed him genuine kindness. Mr. Hill continued. You treated him as a person, not a paycheck. That's why he chose you. A red-faced man, Robert, one of Theodore's cousins, slammed his fist on the table. This is absurd, he bellowed. She's a nobody, a nurse who wormed her way into his life. We'll contest this, Will. Mr. Hill didn't flinch. You're welcome to try, he said coolly. But Theodore anticipated this. He documented everything, his interactions with both Elizabeths, his reasoning, even video recordings. The contrast is striking. I barely heard the renewed outbursts from the relatives. My mind was stuck on Theodore, on the man I'd come to know over those months. Our relationship hadn't been easy at first. He'd been prickly, suspicious, quick to snap when I adjusted his pillows or suggested a medication schedule. But slowly, I'd broken through his walls. I remembered one rainy afternoon when he'd insisted on telling me about his favorite book, The Great Gatsby. It's about a man who chased the wrong dream. He'd said, his voice wistful. I spent my life chasing money. Madison, don't make my mistakes. I'd laughed it off, saying I didn't have enough money to chase. But his words had stayed with me. Now, I realized he'd been trying to teach me something deeper, about values. About what really mattered. As the weeks turned into months, Theodore opened up more. He'd ask about my dreams, my struggles, my mom. I told him how she'd worked double shifts at a diner to keep us afloat. How she'd never complained, even when her cough grew worse and the medical bills piled up. She'd died 2 years ago. Her lungs ravaged by a respiratory disease that no amount of love or care could fix. Theodore had listened intently, his questions oddly specific. What was my mom's maiden name? Where had she grown up? Had she ever mentioned a family rift? I'd thought he was just making conversation, filling the quiet hours of his pain-filled days. But now, I saw those questions in a new light. He'd been searching for his sister's daughter, for the family he'd lost. One memory stood out vividly. It was a crisp spring morning, and Theodore had asked me to wheel him out to the garden. The air smelled of blooming lilacs. And for once, he seemed at peace. Madison, he said, using my first name for the first time. His voice softer than I'd ever heard it. These past few months have been the best I've had in years. You've shown me more kindness than my own flesh and blood. I blushed, unsure how to respond. You've been good to me too. Theodore, I said. You've taught me about life. About seeing things differently. He took my hand. His fingers frail but warm. Promise me something, he said. Whatever happens after I'm gone. Whatever you learn about yourself. Don't let it change who you are. Kindness is the real currency in this world. I promised. Though I didn't understand why he sounded so cryptic. 3 days later, he was gone. His hand in mine. His final words of quiet. Thank you for seeing me as more than a rich old man. Back in the conference room. Mr. Hill's voice pulled me from my memories. Miss Heiress, Theodore left you a letter. Would you like me to read it now? Or would you prefer to read it privately? My throat tightened, tears pricking my eyes. Now, please, I whispered. He opened a sealed envelope and began to read. His voice steady but laced with emotion. My dearest Elizabeth, and yes, I know you prefer Madison? The words washed over me, each one a piece of Theodore's heart, revealing not just his decision but the love and regret he'd carried for a family torn apart by pride and misunderstanding. I was his niece, but more than that, I was the person he'd chosen to carry his legacy, not because of blood, but because of who I was. The conference room felt like a battlefield. The air heavy with resentment as Theodore's relatives glared at me. Their voices now hushed but no less venomous. I sat back down, my hands trembling as I clutched the photograph of my grandmother. Willow Spears. A woman I'd never known but whose face mirrored my own. Mr. Hill's voice, reading Theodore's letter, still echoed in my mind. My dearest Elizabeth. You've shown me what family really means. Each word was a weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I wasn't just Madison Heiress, the nurse who'd stumbled into this world of wealth and secrets. I was Elizabeth Heiress, Theodore's niece, the heir to a $12 million fortune. But more than the money, it was his words, his trust, his love, that shook me to my core. How had I, a woman who'd grown up scraping by, become the center of this storm? Mr. Hill folded the letter carefully, his eyes kind but resolute. Miss Heiress, Theodore's decision was clear. He chose you not just because you're family, but because you earned his respect through your actions. The red-faced cousin, Robert, scoffed loudly, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood. This is a farce. She's a gold digger who played a dying man. I'll have this will thrown out in court. His words stung, but I was too overwhelmed to respond. Mr. Hill, unfazed, adjusted his glasses. Mr. Spears anticipated such challenges. He left meticulous records, notes, videos, even signed affidavits, detailing why he made this choice. You're welcome to contest it. But I assure you, his case is ironclad. Robert's face turned a deeper shade of red. But he sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. The other relatives exchanged glances, their outrage simmering but momentarily subdued. I barely noticed them. My mind drifted back to the months I'd spent with Theodore. To the moments that had seemed so ordinary at the time but now felt like clues to a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. One evening stood out, about a month into my time as his nurse. It was late, the mansion quiet except for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Theodore had been in pain, his medication making him groggy, but he'd insisted on staying up to talk. Madison, he'd said, his voice raspy but warm. Tell me about your mother. What was she like? I'd smiled, picturing her face, tired but kind, always finding a way to make me laugh despite our struggles. She was tough, I said, worked 2 jobs, never complained. She loved old jazz records and would dance around our tiny kitchen when she thought I wasn't watching. Theodore's eyes had sparkled with something I couldn't place, nostalgia. Maybe, or longing. Did she ever talk about her family? He'd asked. I shook my head. Not much. She said her parents were gone, and she didn't have anyone else. It was just us. He'd nodded slowly, his gaze distant. Family can be complicated, he'd said. Sometimes we lose people, not because we want to, but because life pulls us apart. I hadn't thought much of it then. Just another of his reflective moments. But now, I realized he'd been talking about his sister, Willow, my grandmother. He'd been searching for her through me, piecing together a past he'd spent decades regretting. I remembered another moment. A few weeks later, when he'd asked me to bring him a box from his study. It was an old, dusty thing, tucked behind a row of leather-bound books. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, and a single photograph of a young girl with pigtails, laughing in a field. "That's my sister," he'd said softly. "Willow." She was the only person who ever really understood me. I'd asked why they'd lost touch, but he'd waved the question away, his face clouding over. "Pride," was all he said. "Pride and stupidity." Back in the conference room, Mr. Hill's voice pulled me back to the present. "Miss Heiress, there's more to discuss. The estate includes not just the money but the mansion, the art collection, and several investment properties. Theodore left detailed instructions for you." I blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. Properties? Art? This wasn't just about money, it was a legacy. A responsibility I hadn't asked for. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hill smiled gently. "Whatever you think Theodore would have wanted. But I suspect you already know." He was right. Even in that moment, surrounded by wealth I could barely comprehend, I could hear Theodore's voice in my head, talking about his regrets, his dreams, his hope to leave behind something meaningful. I thought of our last conversation in the garden, when he'd taken my hand and made me promise to stay true to myself. "Kindness is the real currency," he'd said. I hadn't understood then, but I was beginning to now. The relatives were still murmuring, their eyes darting between me and Mr. Hill, calculating their next move. I felt like an outsider, an imposter in a world I didn't belong to. But then I remembered Theodore's letter, his words about my heart, my dreams. He'd seen something in me that I hadn't fully seen in myself, a strength, a purpose. I thought back to another moment, one that felt so small at the time but now loomed large. It was a stormy afternoon, and Theodore had been in a rare good mood, teasing me about my terrible chess skills as we played a game in his study. "You're too soft, Madison," he'd said, chuckling as I let him win. "You've got to fight for what you want in this world." I'd laughed, saying I'd rather help people than fight them. He'd looked at me then, his eyes softening. "That's why you're different," he'd said. "You remind me of her, of Willow. She believed in people, too." Now, as I sat in the conference room, I realized he hadn't just been reminiscing. He'd been testing me, watching to see if I was the kind of person who could carry his legacy. Not just his money, but his hopes for a better world. Mr. Hill handed me a folder, thick with legal documents. "These outline the estate's assets," he said. "But there's one more thing Theodore wanted you to have." He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a small, leather-bound photo album. He mentioned it in his letter. "It's in his study, behind the Shakespeare collection. It contains pictures of your mother as a child, your grandmother, your family, before everything fell apart." My throat tightened, tears welling up as I took the album. I hadn't even opened it yet, but I could feel its weight, not just physical, but emotional. It was a piece of my history, a connection to a family I'd never known I had. The relatives' voices grew louder again, their arguments spilling over like a dam breaking. "She doesn't deserve this," one of them shouted, a woman with sharp features and a designer handbag. "She's not even a real Spears." I wanted to shrink away, to run from their anger and my own confusion. But then I thought of Theodore, of the man who'd trusted me, who'd seen me as more than just a nurse. I straightened in my chair, meeting their glares. "I didn't ask for this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But Theodore made his choice, and I'm going to honor it." The room quieted for a moment, surprised by my resolve. Mr. Hill nodded approvingly. "Well said, Miss Heiress. Shall we continue with the details?" As he began explaining the intricacies of the estate, taxes, investments, property management, I let my mind wander back to Theodore's final days. He'd grown weaker, his pain more relentless, but he'd never lost his sharpness. Even in his last moments, he'd been planning, making sure his legacy would live on through me. I remembered his hand in mine, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for seeing me." Now, I understood what he'd meant. He hadn't just wanted a nurse. He'd wanted someone to see him as a person, not a fortune, and in doing so, he'd given me something I'd never expected, a family, a purpose. and a chance to make a difference. The conference room seemed to shrink as Mr. Hill laid out the staggering details of Theodore's estate. $12 million. A mansion that could have doubled as a museum. An art collection rivaling a gallery. And investment properties scattered across the city. It was a world so far removed from my own that it felt like a dream. Or maybe a nightmare. The relatives' glares burned into me. Their whispers a low hum of resentment. But I barely noticed. My fingers traced the edges of the leather-bound photo album Mr. Hill had handed me. Its weight anchoring me to the moment. Theodore's letter. His words about family and kindness. Echoed in my mind. He'd chosen me, not just as his niece but as the keeper of his legacy. But why me? Why now? And how was I supposed to navigate this new reality when I'd spent my life counting pennies? Not millions? Mr. Hill's voice cut through my thoughts. Miss Heiress, Theodore left specific instructions for the estate. But he also trusted your judgment. He believed you'd know how to use this inheritance to make a difference. I nodded, though my mind was a whirlwind. A difference? I'd always dreamed of helping people. Of opening a free clinic for those who couldn't afford care. But dreams were one thing. Turning a fortune into reality was another. The relatives' voices rose again. A woman in a sleek black dress, another cousin. I assumed, pointing at me accusingly. She's not equipped for this. She's a nurse, not a philanthropist. She'll squander it. Her words stung, echoing my own fears. What if I wasn't ready? What if I failed Theodore? But Mr. Hill remained unruffled. Theodore was confident in Miss Heiress' abilities. He left a trust structure to guide her, with advisors to assist. But the final decisions are hers. I took a deep breath. Trying to steady myself, my thoughts drifted back to a moment with Theodore. One that now felt like a cornerstone of this journey. It was a quiet evening. About 2 months into my time as his nurse. We were in his study. The fire crackling softly as he sipped tea I'd brewed to soothe his nausea. He'd been unusually reflective, his sharp wit softened by pain and medication. Madison, he'd said, do you know what I regret most? I'd shaken my head, expecting another story about his business triumphs or losses. Not money, he continued, his voice low. Not power. I regret the people I pushed away. My sister, Willow, your grandmother. She saw the world differently. Believed in helping others, not just building wealth. I thought she was foolish. Now I see I was the fool. I'd listened, my heart aching for him. You're not a fool, I'd said. You've built something incredible. He'd shaken his head, his eyes distant. It's nothing without someone to share it with. Promise me, Madison, that you'll never let pride or money blind you to what matters. That conversation had stayed with me. A quiet reminder of Theodore's depth. His humanity. Now, sitting in this room, I realized he'd been preparing me, not just for his fortune, but for the responsibility it carried. I looked at Mr. Hill, my voice steadier than I felt. What's next? I asked. He smiled, clearly pleased by my resolve. We'll need to review the trust documents and set up meetings with the financial advisors. But first, I suggest you visit the mansion. There's something Theodore wanted you to see. The relatives grumbled, but I ignored them, my mind already racing to the study, to the photo album he'd mentioned, to the pieces of my family's past waiting to be uncovered. That evening, I drove to the Spears mansion, the familiar gates looming larger than ever. Mrs. Clark met me at the door, her stern face softening when she saw me. Miss Heiress, she said, I always knew you were special to him. I followed her to the study, my heart pounding as I stepped into the room where I'd spent so many hours with Theodore. The air still carried his scent, old books, leather, and a faint trace of the lavender oil I'd used to ease his pain. I moved to the bookshelf, my fingers brushing the Shakespeare collection he'd loved. Behind Hamlet, I found it, the photo album, its cover worn but intact. I sat at his desk, opened it, and felt my breath catch. The first page held a picture of a young girl, maybe 6, with my mother's eyes, laughing as she held a daisy. My mom. Below it, in Theodore's precise handwriting, was a note. Elizabeth. Age 6, 1968. My sister's joy. Page after page revealed a family I'd never known. My grandmother, Willow, radiant in a sundress, her arm around a young Theodore. Both of them grinning like they shared a secret. Another photo showed my mom as a teenager. Her face defiant but soft. So much like the woman who'd raised me. There were letters tucked between the pages. Some from Willow to Theodore, pleading with him to value family over wealth. Others from him, apologizing years too late. One letter, dated just a month before I started working for him, was addressed to me, or rather, to Elizabeth Heiress. If you're reading this, it began. I've found you at last. I hope you'll forgive an old man for taking so long. Tears blurred my vision as I read his words. His regrets. His pride in the woman I'd become without ever knowing him. I closed the album, overwhelmed, and looked around the study. This room, once a place of care and conversation, now felt like a bridge to a past I'd never imagined. I remembered another moment with Theodore. One that hadn't seemed significant at the time. It was a chilly morning, and he'd insisted on sitting by the window, watching the first snow dust the gardens. Madison, he'd said, if you could change one thing in the world, what would it be? I'd thought for a moment, then said, I'd make sure everyone had access to healthcare, no matter their bank account. He'd nodded, a faint smile on his lips. That's a good dream, he'd said, hold onto it. Now, I realized he'd been planting a seed, trusting me to carry it forward. As I left the mansion, the album tucked under my arm, I felt a shift inside me. The weight of Theodore's fortune wasn't just financial, it was a call to action. I thought of my mom, who'd sacrificed everything to give me a chance, and of Theodore, who'd spent his final months searching for a way to make amends. I drove back to my tiny apartment, the city lights blurring through my tears. The next morning, I met with Mr. Hill again, this time at his office. He laid out plans for the estate. But I stopped him. I know what I want to do. I said, I want to open a clinic, a free one, for people who can't afford care. I want Theodore's money to help those who need it most. Mr. Hill's eyes lit up. He'd be proud. He said simply, let's make it happen. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the planning. The mansion would become the Theodore Spears Community Health Center, a place where families could get care without fear of bills. The art collection would be sold, the proceeds funding scholarships for nursing students from low-income backgrounds. The investment properties would be repurposed into affordable housing. It was daunting, but every step felt right. Like I was honoring not just Theodore, but my mom, my grandmother, and the values they'd instilled in me. As I worked, I kept the photo album close, a reminder of the family I'd found and the legacy I was building. 6 months had passed since the day in the conference room when my world turned upside down. I stood in the lobby of the newly opened Theodore Spears Community Health Center. The former Spears mansion now transformed into a beacon of hope. The marble floors gleamed under bright lights, and the walls, once adorned with priceless art, now held cheerful posters about health and wellness. Families from the underserved neighborhoods streamed through the doors, their faces a mix of relief and gratitude as they received free medical care. Nurses bustled about, their smiles warm, and the hum of activity filled the air. I watched a young mother leave with her toddler, who clutched a bright red lollipop after a checkup, and felt a lump rise in my throat. This was what Theodore had wanted, not just for his money to be spent, but for it to mean something, to change lives. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. After the will reading, I'd faced endless meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and contractors, each one a reminder of the responsibility I'd inherited. Theodore's relatives hadn't given up easily. Robert, the red-faced cousin, had filed a lawsuit, claiming I'd manipulated a vulnerable old man. But Mr. Hill had been right. Theodore's documentation was airtight. Video recordings of his conversations with me, his notes about my kindness, and even a heartfelt message he'd recorded in his final days had silenced the opposition. Madison is my family, he'd said in one video, his voice weak but resolute. She's the only one who saw me for who I am, not what I have. The judge had dismissed the case, and the relatives had slunk away, their greed no match for Theodore's foresight. As I stood in the clinic, I thought back to a moment just weeks before Theodore's death. It was a quiet afternoon, and we'd been in the garden, the scent of roses heavy in the air. He'd been frail, barely able to sit up. But his eyes were bright with purpose. "Madison," he'd said, "when I'm gone, people will try to take what's yours. They'll call you names, question your worth. Don't let them dim your light." I'd squeezed his hand, promising to stay strong, though I hadn't known then what he was preparing me for. Now, I understood. He'd seen the vultures circling. Not just his relatives but the weight of wealth itself. And he'd trusted me to rise above it. The clinic wasn't the only legacy taking shape. Theodore's art collection, once a symbol of his wealth, had been auctioned off, the proceeds funding a scholarship program for nursing students from low-income families. I'd named it the Willow Spears Scholarship, after my grandmother, whose values had shaped my mother and, in turn, me. The investment properties had been converted into affordable housing complexes, with one named after my mom, Elizabeth Jones, a quiet tribute to the woman who'd taught me resilience. I'd kept enough of the fortune to live comfortably and ensure the clinic's sustainability. But the rest was poured into these projects, each one a step toward fulfilling Theodore's vision of a legacy that mattered. Mrs. Clark, who'd stayed on as the clinic's operations manager, approached me as I stood in the lobby. Her stern demeanor had softened over the months, replaced by a quiet pride. "Mr. Spears would be over the moon," she said, gesturing to the bustling clinic. "You've done right by him." I smiled, my eyes stinging. "I hope so," I said. "I'm still learning how to live up to his trust." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice firm. "You were worthy the moment you walked into his study and treated him like a person. Not a paycheck. That's why he chose you." Her words echoed Theodore's letter, the one I'd read so many times it was nearly memorized. "You are my legacy now. Not because of our shared blood, but because of your beautiful heart." That evening, I retreated to what had once been Theodore's study, now my office at the clinic. The room still held traces of him, the creak of the floorboards, the faint scent of old books. On my desk sat the photo album, its pages worn from my countless visits. I opened it, my fingers lingering on a photo that had become my favorite, Theodore and Willow as teenagers. Their arms around each other, grinning at the camera. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "Willie and Teddy, best friends forever." It was a reminder of a bond broken by pride but restored through love. Through me, I thought of my mom, who'd never known her uncle's regret, and of Willow, whose strength lived on in the work I was doing. They were gone, but they were with me in this room, in this mission. As I looked out the window at the city lights, I reflected on how far I'd come. I'd started as Madison Heiress, a nurse who thought she was alone in the world, save for the memory of her mother. I'd become Elizabeth Heiress, heir to a fortune and a family history I'd never known existed. But more than that, I'd learned that family wasn't just about blood or names or money. It was about connection, about seeing people for who they truly are. Theodore had seen me, not just as a nurse, but as a person with dreams, with a heart that mirrored his sister's. And I'd seen him, past the wealth and the gruff exterior, to the lonely man who just wanted to be remembered. The clinic's opening day had been a whirlwind, but one moment stood out. A little boy, no older than 5, had tugged at my sleeve as his mother filled out paperwork. "Are you the lady who made this place?" he'd asked, his eyes wide. I'd crouched down, smiling. "I had a lot of help," I said, "from someone who wanted to make the world better." He'd grinned, handing me a crumpled drawing of a heart with wings. "This is for you," he'd said. I'd pinned it to my office wall, next to the photo of Theodore and Willow. It was a small thing, but it felt like a piece of Theodore's legacy, a reminder that kindness, not money, was the true currency. As I locked up the clinic that night, the stars bright above the city, I thought of Theodore's final words. "Thank you for seeing me as more than a rich old man." But the truth was, he'd given me more than I'd ever given him. He'd given me a family, a purpose, a chance to make my dreams real. Most importantly, he'd shown me that the greatest discoveries aren't about finding wealth or secrets, they're about finding yourself. About realizing you were worthy all along. I looked back at the clinic, its windows glowing warmly, and whispered, "Thank you, Theodore, for seeing me, too." This journey had changed my circumstances, but it hadn't changed who I was. I was still Madison, the nurse who found joy in helping others, who measured wealth in relationships, not bank accounts. But now, I had the means to make a difference. To honor a man who'd taught me that the greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you inspire others to become. As I walked into the night, the photo album tucked under my arm, I felt Theodore's presence, his pride, his love. I wasn't just carrying his fortune, I was carrying his heart.